Everyone makes mistakes. It's how we learn. But over the years, there have been mistakes so egregious that they've changed the course of history. Either that or they were just really, really dumb. From accidentally flooding a city with beer to drawing imaginary lines that have indirectly led to the deaths of millions, here are some of the dumbest mistakes throughout history. The London Beer Flood.
Beer tsunami, you say? Seems like something out of a college fraternity's best dream. But back in 1814, the streets of central London were flooded with porters in one of the most bizarre and tragic brewery accidents in history.
The Horseshoe Brewery was established in 1623 and became one of London's top producers of porter, a dark beer that goes really well with a hot pot pie on a cold winter night. But by 1814, the brewery's quality control wasn't the best. On October 17th, one of the giant vats holding the beer split open, releasing a lot of hot fermenting porter. A chain reaction occurred and blasted out the entire wall of the building. In all, over 320,000 gallons of beer poured out onto the street. The brewery was located in a densely populated slum, and there was chaos. The wave of beer was apparently 15 feet tall. It collapsed 2 houses, ending the life of 4 people, including a woman and her daughter while they were having tea in one. By the time the beer tsunami receded, 8 people in total lost their lives. In the aftermath, people were scrambling to scoop up all the free beer they could get their lips on. There were reports that a 9th person died of alcohol poisoning a couple days later. The neighborhood reeked of beer for months after the mistake. In the end, no one was held accountable. The brewery was let off the hook, and the company was even given the equivalent of $500,000 in today's money by the government. Authorities called it an act of God, though it was a very real human error caused by not making sure the vats were properly maintained. The Sykes-Picot Agreement.
British politician and diplomatic advisor Mark Sykes loved old maps. He had a massive collection of them at his estate in Yorkshire. Medieval maps, Renaissance maps, maps from different European explorers, geographical manuscripts. Unfortunately for the Middle East, all those maps didn't help him avoid making one of the worst wrong turns in history.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divvied up the crumbling Ottoman Empire in the midst of World War I. It ended up being a bunch of arbitrary lines that didn't take into account any of the ethnic, religious, or tribal divisions in the region, and it helped fuel all the messiness, war, loss, and violence that is still persisting today. Under the agreement, Sykes and his fellow Brits basically used a ruler to cut through Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Some regions, including Iraq, Palestine, Jordan, and Kuwait, were initially controlled by Great Britain. Other regions, including Syria and Lebanon, were controlled by France. Others, including Jerusalem and Bethlehem, were designated as international zones.
It already seems like a bad idea, but the kicker is that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was negotiated in secret, and its terms were not widely known at the time. When the agreement's details were revealed, it led to a whole lot of backlash and resentment in the Arab world because it contradicted earlier promises of Arab independence made by the Allies.
Another lesser-known aspect of the Sykes-Picot Agreement is that the British and French tried to keep it secret from the Russians, who were allies during World War I. The Russians were promised territory in the same region through a separate agreement called the Constantinople Agreement. The British and French were basically double-crossing their Russian allies, which didn't help relations between the two. When the Bolsheviks rose to power in 1917, they published the text of the agreement. Relations between what was soon to be the Soviet Union and the West were already turning cold. The Partition of India.
Let's talk about an arbitrary line that's led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and still continues today. The Partition of India was a disaster. It was spearheaded by a guy named Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India who loved to wear colorful, elaborately patterned socks. Maybe he should have focused less on his sock game and more on not ruining an entire region. Just saying.
India had been a British colony for nearly 2 centuries when the struggle for independence intensified in the 1940s, led mainly by the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. The Muslim League, led by a guy named Muhammad Ali Jinnah, wanted its own nation. The British, who had just been blown to bits in World War II, were facing more and more pressure to get the heck out of India. In 1947, they finally decided to leave. But first, they had to figure out how to divide up the country. What resulted was the Mountbatten Plan. India was divided along religious lines. India would hold the Hindus, Pakistan the Muslims. Punjab and Bengal, two provinces with mixed populations, were to be divided between the two nations. The plan was accepted, and the Indian Independence Act of 1947 was passed by the British Parliament, setting the date for independence as August 15, 1947.
The partition unleashed a wave of violence and communal riots as people from different religious communities clashed. Horrific violence erupted as people scrambled to figure out where to go. The border between India and Pakistan was hastily drawn, and the process of partition wasn't really planned at all. Millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of the border, leading to chaotic and deadly migrations.
Trains filled with refugees became targets for violence, and millions of people were ended or displaced during the journey. In the months following the partition, estimates of the death toll varied a lot. Some say a few 100,000 people lost their lives. Others put the number around 2 million. Leaded.
In December of 1921, engineer and chemist Thomas Midgley struck gold. Actually, he struck lead. He'd figured out that by adding a bit of it to fuel, it prevented what's called knocking in an engine, a clunky sound that occurs when the combustion in an engine is out of whack. The only problem, though, is that lead is highly toxic.
Using lead in products is nothing new. The ancient Greeks put it in their makeup. Queen Elizabeth I was known to use the stuff, called Venetian ceru, so much that it might have ended her life. But when you stick it in gasoline, and then stick that gas in hundreds of millions of cars around the world, you get one of the dumbest mistakes in history. Elevated lead levels from leaded gasoline exposure were linked to lead poisoning in millions of people, particularly young adults. It's also been linked to developmental delays and cognitive impairments, behavioral issues, and cardiovascular diseases. The U.S. finally introduced regulations to reduce lead levels in gasoline in the 1970s. The Clean Air Act amendments of 1970 was the start of the effort to phase it out. In the following decades, unleaded gasoline became the norm, but it was not the norm for a lot of countries. It wasn't until 2021 that the use of leaded gasoline was officially eliminated worldwide. Algeria was the final country to make the switch, but the effects of a century of spewing lead into the air will be felt far into the future. Lead doesn't break down naturally, and the lead that was released into the atmosphere and deposited in soil over decades can persist for a very long time. This has led to people dubbing the 20th century the lead era. There's a distinctive layer of soil which elevated lead levels that could be detected by future researchers or even extraterrestrial visitors who come to Earth thousands of years in the future. Gallipoli Campaign.
In 1915, 1 year into World War I, Great Britain, Ireland, France, Australia, and New Zealand decided to invade the crumbling Ottoman Empire. It was a mistake, huge mistake. After a year fighting and the loss of 44,000 Allied lives, they decided to call it quits.
Gallipoli sits at the tip of the Dardanelles Strait, a strategic choke point that connects the Aegean Sea to the Marmara Sea, which leads to the Bosphorus Strait and then the Black Sea. Whoever can control it makes that country the gatekeeper of one of the most important trade routes in the world, connecting the Mediterranean to Black Sea countries like Russia and Eastern Europe. Seeing that the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, the Allied coalition decided to try to take it. The so-called Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, or the MEF, sent 75,000 troops, half of which were from New Zealand and Australia, to try and take Gallipoli. The problem was that the Dardanelles Strait is a nearly impossible place to invade. There are limited places to make landings. The hilly terrain made it easy for the Ottomans to see the enemy coming. The Ottomans had also established a network of coastal defenses, including trenches and machine gun positions, and were able to pick off the Allied forces as they were attempting to make landfall.
On a more lighthearted note, there was something called the Battle of Wines during the Gallipoli Campaign, which was less of a battle and more of a temporary ceasefire. Now, the story goes that a British supply ship carrying a cargo of wine for the troops ran aground near the Gallipoli Peninsula. The mistake resulted in barrels of wine washing up on shore, much to the delight of the thirsty soldiers. Soon, both Allied and Ottoman troops found themselves engaging in a strange and informal truce to enjoy the unexpected bounty. Soldiers from both sides ventured out to pick up the wine barrels and even had some non-violent exchanges and conversations. But I'm guessing when the wine ran out, so did the good-hearted spirit.
Friendly fire. Usually when a country loses a battle or a war, it's because their opponent had superior firepower or better tactics or a more organized army. But in 1788, The Austrians lost the Battle of Karensu because they didn't realize they were fighting themselves. It usually pays to double-check before you commit to something, especially if that something is a matter of life or death. Look before they leap, as they say. On the night of September 22, 1788, amidst the backdrop of the Austro-Turkish War, the Austrian army sat in camp waiting to confront the Ottoman forces in what's now Romania. As darkness fell, the Austrian troops were hunkered down outside the town of Karensu, waiting for news about where the Ottoman forces were and planning for the battle that everyone was expecting to happen. Some soldiers had wandered from the camp and into the town to see if they could scrounge up any supplies, Walking Dead style. There was an unverified legend that a good portion of the supplies they did scrounge up were schnapps. The liquor helped lubricate their imaginations, apparently, and might have led to what would come next. As the soldiers in town returned to camp, they thought they'd spotted some Ottoman soldiers lurking in the shadows. Full of schnapps, or full of war paranoia, which is often the case regardless of alcohol consumption, they shouted, "Turchi!" or Turks, convinced that the enemy was coming to get them. Chaos followed. The Austrian soldiers, in the dark and amid the noise and ruckus, started firing their muskets and cannons indiscriminately, thinking they were repelling the Ottoman advance. But there was no Ottoman advance. The chaotic firefight raged on for hours. Soldiers were shooting at each other in the pitch-black night. The outcome wasn't a good look for the Austrian army. It's estimated that over 10,000 Austrian soldiers were eliminated or wounded in this madness. When daylight finally broke and the Austrians realized what they'd done, they just abandoned camp. The Ottomans would eventually occupy Karensu without needing to fire a single shot. Not a bad deal as far as the Ottomans were concerned. Thanks for watching. What other dumb mistakes from history do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History.